I don't know, but we went live right now in the middle of that question, so we should, if we have a name
All
for this,
right.
this would be the time for it.
Hello, everybody. This is Mark Baker and John Mitzmacher with our special guest Allison Fine with the second of our podcasts. I myself, Mark, am here broadcasting from a snow bunker in the Northeast, and John, I presume you are in the weather-boring Florida right now.
I am. I will say, though, today we did have to put jackets on our children on the way to school, which was slightly devastating for them. But other than that, we are hanging in here in North Florida this week.
I'm sorry that you do not get the full experience of the seasons down there, but it has been a heck of a winter up here in the Northeast, in Boston in particular.
That is for sure. That is for sure. But that weather provides us with a fantastic opportunity to lead into our first subject. But before we do that, we want to make sure that that those who are watching it live know that there is an opportunity to ask your questions, and we will be tracking those. So if you have questions for us, or more importantly, if you have questions for Allison when we get into that subject, please, please, please ask them here in the Google Hangout. We really want to be able to make sure that that we ask your questions and we get good answers for them. We want this to be as interactive as possible. But Mark, speaking of having a tremendous amount of snow days, you came across...
Yes, our news from the field segment this morning is going to focus on what it means for school and Jewish education to have this much snow. The news from the field in Boston is, the last report I saw was 59.1 inches in February alone. My kids were literally jumping off of our back porch into snowbanks on the last snow day, and 96.3 inches as a total for this winter in Boston, and it has gone from fun and novel to somewhat distressing, just to live in Boston and not to be able to make your way through the roads. But as a Jewish educator and school leader, I have to say calling snow days is a real drag, something that, believe it or not, is more stressful than most people could possibly imagine, as you know if you're ahead of school. And in Boston, it's raised a lot of questions, technical questions like how do we know when to open school and when is it safe for our kids to be on the road? And I think bigger adaptive questions like what does education look like in a world where the weather is less and less predictable? And in that spirit, I wanted to share a blog post by actually a parent in my children's school, Matt Volpe. Matt and Anna have a consulting company. They have a website called www.tovana.com, T-O-V-A-N-A, and they blogged during this last storm. They created a blog post called something about essentially why we have snow days anymore and not learn from home days. And Matt raises the question, why is school closed just because the building is closed? And he challenges, I think, all of us to think differently about what school really means, especially when we have snow day after snow day after snow day. And again, his challenge is that we proudly and joyfully announce not school is canceled, but we are announcing a learning from home day. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. John, in particular, who's done so much work on 21st century learning and thinking differently about what education can look like.
So to me, it's a fascinating question. What would it mean with so many of our schools already utilizing technology in school and now out of school, recognizing that the boundaries are no longer quite as clear as they used to be between the bounded time and space of being in school and not being in school, whether or not schools that are experiencing these kinds of delays have begun to experiment with those new technologies to make sure that learning continues. Do you know, Mark, have any schools, or have you yourself at your school, what actually have you done or on the ground to actually keep the learning moving so far, even if they're just sort of thought experiments in this stage?
I mean, at this point, what I've seen in my kids' schools and our school has mostly been kind of ongoing communication between teachers and students, reminding them that there still is work to do. There's work they can do from home. The learning can continue. I had students at GAN say, you know, believe me, we weren't just sitting around all day. We were doing kind of long-term projects, even during the snow days. What we have not done yet, and I think raises interesting questions, is, you know, kind of virtual classrooms, expecting teachers and students to hold class. One of the things that Matt and Anna suggested in this blog post is, you know, ideally, we would just have class as normal, and everyone would just show up in a Google Hangout. I wonder whether that's actually ideal, whether that's what we should be striving for, or whether we should be thinking about other creative ways to make sure that the learning continues. I can tell you that some of the people I spoke to, some parents I spoke to said, why aren't you giving my kids learning during these days? And others said, you know, be careful, don't pile on the learning during these days. There's still something fun and joyous about a snow day, and you want to be careful about creating a negative dynamic with the kids. I don't think it's quite as simple as it seems.
I think it raises two different points. So one point it raises is practical. So to the degree that schools wind up losing so much school time that there's real danger in either not being able to schedule enough makeup days to ensure that the full educational agenda gets reached, that would be a practical reason to be more serious about structured out-of-school experiences, whether they're synchronous, whether they're asynchronous, depending on the age of the child, whether there are assignments that are posted that are expected to happen during these days from home. We know it can be done. From a practical standpoint, that could be one of the reasons to do it. To me, it also raises the more interesting question, which is whether or not we should be thinking about this only in terms of what happens when school has to be closed, as opposed to thinking about what it really means now for schools to be engaged in thinking about what it could mean all the time. I'll use my own child's experience as a starting point. So my child is in the school that I used to run, where every child in the school has a blog that they are required to keep as part of the school experience. But we know that most kids will only go onto their blogs when they're asked to do so as part of an official school assignment. Write a blog post about X, post something about Y. There are some kids, and that's one of the things that's great about the platform, is there are kids who actually go on their own. They want to write about their experience, they want to post something, and that's great, but that's purely voluntary. The part that's missing is really trying to think more critically about how and when to really think about an education without those kinds of artificial boundaries and borders. Right? When would a school require, or could a school think about requiring students to use off time and space for the purpose of school? And could there be trade-offs? Right? You run a high school. Could you imagine a scenario where project-based learning could happen in different times and spaces that would or could mean students actually not being in school during what would be traditional time and space?
Right. Look, I think these are some of the questions that this raises, and one thing we have learned for sure here in Boston is that we cannot approach this reactively. We need snow day, but more broadly, I think, kind of boundaryless learning plans, so that we're not reacting to this kind of weather, but actually, ideally, this weather, as you alluded to, is simply one piece of a broader vision for learning that breaks down the boundaries of the school walls. I think Matt and Anna's blog post is right on there, and I think it's consistent with many of the things that you've been thinking about and that many of our schools have been thinking about, and probably that we'll talk about as we move on to our kind of featured segment here with Allison.
Right. Right before we move there, I wanted to, first of all, any link that we mention as part of the podcast, instead of spelling them all out, if people are interested, we can post those afterwards on the Facebook page. I want to leave you with one link that I think speaks to this. There's a great clip that I've seen presented at conferences by my good friend Sylvia Talisano that I just showed at a conference. The Onion did a wonderful 3-minute video on a historical reenactment of a blockbuster video. What it would look like if it was one of the, if you were doing an old-time reenactment from like the 1800s, but they did it on a blockbuster video. It's a wonderful piece of satire that shows people, the struggles that we used to have when we had to physically leave our homes and go to a store to get a video that may or may not be there, and all of the fraught danger and peril that went with that kind of. Can you imagine living in a world where you actually had to do that in order to to watch a movie? And in one way, you could be thinking about schools the same way. And we may be entering a period of time where we may actually be thinking, do you remember a time when we actually had to physically go to school and be there during this bounded period of time in order to learn the stuff that we needed to learn? Like, we could be entering a time period where people could be thinking about that. And I'm happy to post that link. So
Great.
I think this issue raises something that I think is very much connected to our guest. By way of introduction, I want to read a quote from Allison Fine's new book, Matterness, that I think actually speaks to this idea. She has a quote early on in the book where she reminds us that we are living online and on land at the same time, not in one space or the other, but in both spaces together simultaneously. And I thought of that quote while we were thinking about this issue of the snow day. If you replace on land with in school, to me, that's the sentiment. We both exist online, and our students and our teachers live both online and in school at the same time, simultaneously. And have we thought carefully enough about what that actually means? So that's by way of segue to bring on our guests today. We are very pleased to have our very first official live guest on the podcast. Hopefully, she'll be the first of many. By way of introduction, I will let you know that Allison Fine is among the preeminent guides to the social media revolution. Her gift is for converting uncertainty over rapid change into excitement over remaking organizations by the least expensive and most profitable means available, connecting with others. She is the author of the award-winning Momentum, Igniting Social Change in the Connected Age, co-author of the best-selling The Network Nonprofit and Social Citizens Beta. She's also co-editor of Rebooting America and writes about the intersection of social media and social change on her blog, A Fine Blog. And she is, of course, the author of her most recent book, Matterness, Fearless Leadership for a Social World. We are very pleased to welcome Allison to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mark, for having me. I'm glad to be your first live guest. I suppose the last one might not have been live.
So by way of getting us started, I think it would be great for us to hear a little bit from you about what inspired you to write the book, and for those who may not have read it yet, but who certainly will have decided to by the end of this, if you could just give them some sense for the book.
Sure. Thank you. So this is my third book in 10 years about the impact of social media on people and on institutions. And as we were coming up to a decade of doing this, the first phase was, all the excitement about all the new tools and how they could be used, how we could use blogs, how we could use, when Facebook and YouTube came online. And there was that great, thrilling excitement of all of these new toys to play with. And that's when I wrote Momentum, saying to organizational leaders, these tools are coming, and they are pushing power out from institutions to individuals. And then the second phase, when Beth Cantor and I wrote The Network Nonprofit, was to say when organizations began to use the tool set, the social media tool set, wholeheartedly, they began to look and operate more like social networks than like organizations. They were flatter, they were easier to get in and get out, and they enabled people on the outside to participate more. But I looked up last year and saw even though these lessons were so clearly embedded in all the conversations we were having with organizations, the fact was that too many organizations continue to act and operate like top-down hierarchies, like fortresses. And so this book, I wanted to figure out, why does that keep happening? What is it about our assumptions about work and about institutions and our fears that are stopping us from really embracing the power? And the answer to the question came, I think, in the form of what I call matterness, which of course I made up, which is the idea that in order to become fearless in this world, we have to intentionally, actively, enthusiastically make other people matter more, that this is a fundamental principle of new leadership. And when that happens, the fears that have been holding people captive inside of their fortresses go away. So that's the point of the book.
Allison, let me just jump in with a question that may give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about matterness. I think many people think that, you know, the idea of people and relationships and connectedness and community mattering more runs counter to more social media, more technology, more online. And can you just talk about the relationship between those two things and that what may be kind of incorrect belief that many people have?
Sure. So there's good tech and there's bad tech, right? So the stereotypes around bad tech is that they are sucking our humanity. They're turning us all into products of algorithms and automated beings. And organizations, a lot of organizations use tech that way. You know, I certainly don't feel like Amazon appreciates me as a person. Amazon appreciates me as a product of their algorithms. I only matter to Amazon as far as my next purchase of a book goes. And so that is one way to deal with tech, and I think it's an enormously limiting and very pessimistic view of humanity. Clay Shirky wrote in Here Comes Everybody that technology gets interesting when it gets out of the way, when we don't even see that we're using it. And that is the tech that I'm interested in, the tech that actually enhances our sociability, that enables us to be more of who we are and to do what we're meant to do. Mark, as people, we are meant to be tribal. We are meant to be connected with one another. It makes us feel good to be generous. And a lot of the social media technology enables us to do that, and that's the technology and the use of it that I'm particularly focused on.
John, you want to jump in, or
I
I go on with another one?
I think you should. I am monitoring the tech side here for a second, so I think you should go ahead and ask the next question, and I will be ready.
Great. So let me just say, Allison, and when I read the book, one of the things that I was struck by, and I'm learning this when I read more and more about social media, and each time I read it, I'm reminded of it. I feel like I need to relearn it. I myself am not a huge social media kind of techie yet. I'm trying to learn. But one of the things I'm reminded, as you just said, is it's not about the tech. It's not about the social media. It's about community. It's about culture. It's about leadership. It's about communication. These are just tools, and they're tools that we can use, you know, for the better and for the worse, and to create more matterness or less. And one of the things I was struck by reading this was kind of the leadership implications of this. And you wrote a lot in the book about fear. I'd love to hear a little more from you, what you discovered as you were writing this, about kind of what are some of the fears that hold people back from from embracing social media, from communicating the way you think they could be communicating in order to create more matterness. Kind of what are the fears that hold people back, and maybe what can we do about those?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book, Mark. That's very nice to hear. And second, there are a group of fears that I would say people who were born and bred last century bring to their work, and they allow it to get triggered by social media. So the first one is, and they're kind of mythical. I think of them more as mythical assumptions than fears. So the first myth is that people are by nature unkind. That it's kind of like the good guys finish last, which I write in the book. Leo DeRocha, the legendary manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, said, but he actually never said it, which I really like. So this idea that the job of leadership is to protect organizations from those scary wackadoodles on the outside that, you know, are coming to breach our fortress walls. And when you begin from that premise, it becomes almost impossible to get into conversation, to get really engaged with your community, because that fear makes it very, very hard to feel vulnerable, which is the opposite of assuming that everybody out there is going to attack you. So that's the beginning, right, is that the assumption that we have to be on alert for attackers out there, and that they are, you know, an overwhelming number of them. There's not any evidence to support that whatsoever. then that leads to the second.
Allison, can you just bring that down very concretely for us, like how that fear manifests in choices that leaders and organizations make?
Absolutely. So, Mark, at a social media level, the issue where it comes up most often is an organization saying, we're going to put up a blog, but we're not going to have any comments open on it. Right? We're going to have a Twitter stream, but the CEO has to approve the tweets that are going out. Right? So it is this overly controlling, overly fearful idea of opening up to the world and being in conversation instead of being in broadcast, which is just shooting messages at the world.
Got it.
I can't tell you how often I hear from people that the immediate default setting in their organization is that you can't open yourself up to something like blog comments because you're opening yourself up to attack. It's just almost endemic in boardrooms and C-suites, particularly across the Jewish institutional world. It seems to be very well embedded for us. So the second thing is that social media in and of itself, just as a tool set, automatically makes people less civil, that they are more likely to be trolls and to be attacking. And again, there is no evidence to support that. Some people do really horrible things online. There is no question about that. But they don't do any greater number of them online than they do on land. The sad fact is, when they do it online, the rest of us can see it. And that's the problem, is that we can see it. But it is not so great that it warrants being overly cautious, right? The price, there's an opportunity cost of being overly cautious out in the world.
Yeah.
And that is that you cannot find out how people really think about your school or your effort. You can't really get them engaged wholeheartedly if they can't get through, they can't get over the moat to get into the fortress. And the third issue is that it is smarter for leadership to be overly controlling, overly fearful, and to be any other way is not smart. And I think that's enormously paralyzing for organizations. And this is where boards come in, because boards can reinforce that kind of issue, or boards can help the leadership of organizations become better risk takers.
So I just want to mention that I believe if we had any technical issues with the ability to submit questions, they've been resolved. So if you have, and if you were unable to and would still like to, we would encourage you to go ahead and submit those questions. You know, one of the things that struck me both about the book and has been reinforced by your answer, just to take it down to like a real micro level, and we definitely try, Mark and I definitely try not to use our own experiences too much as the basis for these conversations, but I was really struck by when we, in my last school, when we moved to a blogging platform, the number of questions and concerns from parents about transparency and privacy and what would happen and if kids' information was being posted and all of the things that people were concerned about were really big factors in some of our opening conversations. And we opened by giving parents maximal control over what happened, and they still do, meaning you could decide if you wanted your child's blog to be, you know, public and available for comment. You could have it password protected. You could have an avatar for your child. We gave a whole range of options. By the end of the first 6 to 8 months of experimenting, almost every parent had opted for maximal transparency. Once they began to see the power of what was happening, people overwhelmingly responded positive to, you know, kids would put things out there and people would respond positively, people you've never seen before, never met before, and after seeing that, many parents opted for maximal transparency as they move their way through. I was curious to know, as someone who is familiar with the world of Jewish day school, whether or not you see these things playing, whether there are different implications or other things that Jewish day school leaders should be thinking about when it comes to matterness that might be specific to the field, or whether or not, or I guess whether this applies exactly in the same way to Jewish day schools as it does to other organizations that you're familiar with.
So I am a day school parent, which has been a wonderful experience. And I don't know that it's any more cautious, John, than other school settings, but certainly any institution that is serving young people have a need to be smartly cautious. And what you outlined with those blogs was a very smart way to start that. You don't just start wide open. You explain the situation and then allow people to make their own choices about how open, how closed. And they will almost always end up sliding into more open. It just is a more natural way of working, and the kids are more used to working that way. The thing that's very interesting about organizations and these kind of open or closed default settings, as we were just talking about, is that organizations so often have their default settings set with the idea that we have to be prepared for the worst case scenario, even though it's much more likely that it's not going to happen. So we focus on what could possibly go wrong instead of what is probably going to go right. It's very, very important that leaders in the institution, in the ecosystem, take those fears and make them conversation starters instead of conversation stoppers. They need to focus on how to push past the fears, and you can do that through scenarios. What happens if we open up and somebody criticizes us? And usually that's a shutdown as soon as that first level of fear kicks in. And the point of leading through matterness is to say, okay, then what happens? And to push to the probable, which is that things will go well, instead of the possible that something could possibly go wrong.
John, we actually have a question from a listener that's, I think, a somewhat technical question that you might want to take because it seems to relate to your blog example, which is there an age too young for kids to be out there on blogs? Like, how does this entire matterness conversation relate to kind of ages, kids, adults? Are there developmental stages for this work? Or are we just opening everything up?
Right. So I want to just before we segue to that,
yeah,
I want to just I was just to close off the last part of the conversation, which was I think still dealing with schools as institutions similar to the other kinds of institutions that the book deals with. I guess to try to ask the question maybe in a slightly different way, Allison, like if you could paint a picture of what a Jewish day school who really buys in and embodies matterness the way you describe it in the book, like what would that school look like that may be sort of different than the way our schools presently operate?
I think the biggest difference, John, would be being in conversation with students and parents much earlier about issues, particularly about strategic issues. So, you know, we experience the schools as parents, as so many schools. Again, it's not just endemic here, but here's, you know, this is the setting that we know well. That parents and students are the recipients of strategic decisions that have been made. What are we going to for instance, the opening discussion you all were having about snow days is a perfect example of that. Organizations will tend to have that conversation in closed rooms, you know, behind closed doors, in the boardroom, rather than taking a really interesting question like that has so many interesting parts to it, and it includes learning, it includes joyfulness, it includes life serendipity. To me, it includes humanity, a whole bunch of interesting things. And opening it up to the community to have a conversation about it where we could explore things. So there doesn't seem to be enough room for exploring and learning and strategy development all together as a community. And I think that's a waste. I think that's a lost opportunity.
Indeed. Anyway, so the question that was posed was specific to blogs, and one of the things that I had written down in my notes to the book when I was reading it, because I also read it, Mark, was a lot of, you know, the book deals mostly with looking at organizations, as a whole, thinking of the professionals who lead the organizations, the board members, sort of customers and stakeholders. And I was thinking about whether or not it actually, what the educational implications would be. Like, what would a classroom look like who embodied matterness? The relationship between a teacher and a student and the parents in his or her classroom, like on a more micro level in the life of a school, looking at the students as the ones who need to matter and have their matterness, felt as be part of the shared experience. And I was actually going to ask you about how you thought what you thought maybe the educational implications might be, but this question actually feeds that. So I can only tell the person who asked the question from my own experience with doing this in the school that I ran and helping other schools set up blog folios and blogging platforms for their school. We started as young as kindergarten and up. Every child has their own blog. Again, parents of the youngest ages had the most transparency concerns, and obviously every parent was left ultimately to decide for themselves what they felt was best for their own child. But as Allison suggested, as it launched, people began to opt more and more for maximal transparency when they saw the benefits of what that transparency had on the child who had it. Obviously, from a kindergartner, developmentally, the teacher's much more engaged in directing the student and having material put on the blog. And as they get older, ownership sorts moves from the teacher to the student. In the school that I ran, that transition happened between 2nd and 3rd grade. By 4th grade, the child essentially is the lead owner of the blog with teacher support and input. Other schools have different ways of engaging students in blogs and blog folios, but from my personal opinion as an educator, so long as there's a structure in place, there really is no right age. Kindergartners are very capable, surprisingly capable, of sharing pictures and sharing ideas, sharing voice thread, posting things. They're very capable of doing that. And again, some of the privacy and transparency concerns, which I understand are real. I'm a parent myself, but once you get out there and see that in fact the world really is not populated and I love what you said, Allison, about the bad behavior. We tell parents all the time, bad behavior exists in the real on land as it does online. We would tell parents all the time that how are you going to deal with online bullying? How are you going to deal with online issues? And we would try that the same way we deal with it offline. We recognize there's an ease to it. There are some different ramifications about what happens online, but the basic principles are the same. We want to make sure that good behavior is good behavior. It's being enforced. But I was curious, Allison. So from your perspective, if you see educational implications in how teachers and educators could be thinking about matterness in their schools, not just with sort of the parents, but also perhaps with students.
I think the role of teacher is going to change fundamentally over the next 10 years, John. And whereas I think of organizations becoming platforms for connecting people and resources, I think of teachers are going to become curators of information. They can point to where the information exists. They don't have to be the pusher of the content. They don't have to be the sole content provider. And I hope, given all the tools that we have for enabling self-learning, self-guided learning in the future, that the role of the teacher becomes much more of a facilitator for helping students to learn from one another, building their own learning plans, exploring at their own pace, and it becomes, I think, a much more, I would think as a teacher, it becomes a much more individualized effort, and I think a much more interesting effort rather than being the one who's up and lecturing about things. And as we've seen with Khan Academy, you can take care of the lecture piece by having the best people in the world do the lectures, and it's there. And then the classroom time is really spent on that facilitation and connecting piece, learning from one another, and making the kids teachers as well as learners. I think it's a very exciting opportunity.
I want to bring it back to a similar question to what John is asking, but a kind of a broader leadership question, which I think is relevant in schools, but also more broadly just in leading any organization. You know, I find everything you're saying compelling. I also find it a bit overwhelming. I don't know if I find it frightening exactly, but because I think kind of vulnerability and openness in general is something that resonates with me. I'm thinking about operationalizing this and the challenges that it creates. A couple of the things that come to my mind are simply the pace of our organizations. What you're describing, you know, about bringing more strategic conversations to parents, students, other stakeholders, involving them more in the process, just takes time. It requires you to slow down. It can slow down decision-making processes, and I'm sure that others have experienced this. I oftentimes, as a leader, am faced with this dilemma of when I do open it up and I do slow down, oftentimes I'm accused of this thing takes forever and nothing ever happens around here. And then when I just make decisions, people say we weren't included in the process and this wasn't as transparent a decision as possible. And I think I'm sure that both are true, certainly for them. But you know, in terms of operationalizing this, you know, deciding which things to bring to people. Surely everything can't be open and processed, I don't think you would say. But, you know, can you talk a little bit about kind of first steps and how to not just simply sit here and be overwhelmed by this, but actually imagine moving toward this kind of leadership?
I use a term in the book, Mark, of the churn to describe that internal process that takes over in almost every single organization. And the more the churn is allowed to be in charge, the greater the distance between what's happening internally and how people feel externally. And in schools in particular, given that they are so time crunched, there's so much that has to be done in such a short period of time every year, I think that they are one of the greatest churn factories around schools. And as a parent, and I have 3 kids in 3 very different school systems, the one abiding ethos across all of those different school systems is the churn, is the feeling like they are working as fast as they can to keep up with the curriculum needs, to keep up with the testing needs, to keep up with, you know, the college search needs, whatever the needs are that are pressing on them. If I were running a school, what I would do is I would take a week, as soon as the school year ends, take a deep breath. I would put everything that we do in the middle of the table and see if there are some things that we can take off the table. Because what happens in systems that are captive of the churn is things keep getting added and added to processes, sometimes because of fear. We need multiple checkoffs on things, and sometimes just because of habit, and nothing comes off, right? What can we stop doing, or what could we do differently that would make it feel a little bit better? So, for instance, in one school district that I'm a member of, I get a newsletter that's for the entire school, and I think I don't really need kindergarten information at this point. You know, I need my grade, my kid, and that might make it easier for them if they could segment a little bit. It certainly would make it more meaningful to me to get that information. So first we need to figure out what to take off the plate. Then we need to figure out some strategic places, Mark, where Matterness could come into play for next year as some experiments. So for instance, the question that you all raised at the beginning of this session about snow days, and maybe they could be different. Maybe we could have a conversation with parents and with kids all together about homework. You know, that's certainly something of interest to everybody, how to make homework more impactful and maybe not take over our lives. Look for some strategic points where the process doesn't have to take over. And I think when we begin to practice a little bit, practice a way of saying that the school doesn't have all the answers to everything. School really had, you know, no institution has the answers to everything. And that part of the process is involving people, that's not an extra step, that is the step, that's the most important thing to do. Then we can begin to build a different kind of relationship between inside and outside. Because part of what makes institutional life so exhausting is that inside life feels so lonely and so overwhelming. If we can open it up to the world a little bit, it can be a little bit less overwhelming, a little bit less lonely. And I think that would be a wonderful thing for organizations and for people who lead them.
I don't know about you, Mark, but I just know listening to that and to a lot of this, there's so much of what I'm hearing that resonates and connects with other more traditional educational theorists that we've been reading and exploring sort of in the area of 21st century learning, and there's so much, it feels to me as I'm listening, there's so much really positive overlap between what we're beginning to learn is what's considered to be best practice in terms of teaching and learning from educational theorists, and a lot that we're hearing here about implications for sort of looking at institutional management and applying it into the classroom. Like that really was really resonating for me how much those two things really dovetail. And I'm sort of thinking aloud that, and I don't know, I'm sure you have plenty to do, Allison, but I'm thinking aloud, like, how interesting would it be, or could we, if it doesn't already exist, could we create a forum for sharing stories of schools who are experimenting with matterness and really being able to, if I remember all my terminology correctly, maybe we can create a cascade of really positive examples of schools who maybe take on some of these experiments. And I don't know if that's something that we can do, or something that we can just sort of evolves through, people tweeting out things under the hashtag, I don't know, school matterness, or I don't know, there could be a way of thinking about it. It'd be really interesting to, as more and more people read the book and want to experiment with it, it'd be really great to have a vehicle for ensuring that people don't think that they're the only ones experimenting, and that until we can bring people together around these ideas. I don't know if you're doing that already, sort of broadly under the Matterness hashtag, or through as you're giving more of these talks and getting out to communities. But it'd be great to know if there's a forum for sharing success stories.
Well, I wonder, John, if JedLab might be able to be that forum. I could certainly ask if they might be willing. It seems to be perhaps a good rubric, a good place to have the conversation. I would love to have that conversation. Sounds terrific.
Yeah, no, I think that JedLab could be an excellent vehicle for that. I think that
I'm going to write that down.
There could be others as well, but definitely, I love the idea of being able to capitalize on each other's experiences, and to be able to ensure that whatever we get out of this podcast, but more importantly, as people begin to really dive deep into it, there's an opportunity to continue the conversation. If I'm reading my time correctly, Mark, I think we are drawing towards the end here, right?
We are. I wanted to say a quick word of thanks myself to Allison, and just to add that I think the other thing that I'm just kind of thinking about here is what I sometimes again find a bit paradoxical, but that the very people like you, Allison, who are studying social media and their impact on organizations and leadership and culture, are coming out and saying that these tools, these social media tools, the very things that tend to be creating churn in our lives, that are overwhelming so many of us who are, can be glued to screens and feeds and emails and other things. The message you're sharing is slow down. You've got to slow down if you're going to actually create genuine relationships, culture, community, connectedness that ultimately are going to help our organizations to thrive. And that is just such a strong and important, kind of humbling message. I hope it's something that we can think more about together.
It's a Jewish one. I mean, the thing that we didn't get to that I'm always fascinated about is sort of always trying to ask the question about whether or not there's something uniquely Jewish, or could or should there be something uniquely Jewish about these ideas that sometimes get drawn from the broader world and then get translated back in. Right? Is there something unique about Jewish matterness, or could there or should there be? Right? Shabbat as an opportunity to unplug and to separate yourself from the churn. Like there's something very, very Jewish about that idea that I'm always wondering. Like if we were to do another podcast on this topic, like that would be a natural question to ask. Like, is there something unique about Judaism, or could there be something uniquely Jewish about this that we should be we should be thinking about when we're thinking about translating them into Jewish contexts. But like you, I just really want to thank Allison for the time, but more importantly for the book, because I think it's given a lot of us a lot of things to think about, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we collectively make of it as we move forward.
I'm so grateful to you both for asking me to join, to be part of your budding experiment here. I feel so strongly that there is so much goodness out there, online, on land, that people are intending to be generous and to be kind. And it is the job of leaders of institutions to take advantage of that and to help people bring out their best selves. It's also the job of leaders to help us to shut down. I love the story of Volkswagen shutting down its email servers every night and giving people a break. And I think we have to create that balance. We have to make good choices as leaders to create balance for people. And that we are on the precipice of, I think, a wonderful era of learning and sharing and connecting with one another. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to share that.
Well, thank you for being with us. Speaking, Mark, of learning and sharing and connecting and collaborating, we would be we should use this as an opportunity to remind people that we have a wonderful opportunity coming up to do the very same thing. The North American Jewish Day School Conference is coming March 8th to 10th in Philadelphia. I know you'll be presenting, I think, 14 or 15 times there. I think that's what it sounds like, if I read it correctly, Mark. And I'll be presenting a couple times as well. Mark, you want to just give us a couple highlights of what you're going to be presenting on?
Sure, and I think the theme this year of systems thinking and trying to get outside our schools and our field and slow down enough to look at them through a systems lens is completely related to our Matterness conversation. I'm going to be doing, with some of our colleagues from the Day School Leadership Training Institute, kind of conversations that we should be having but are not having enough about our schools and the field. I'll be doing another session with the fabulous Vivian Troen, an extraordinary consultant on teaching and learning, a kind of deep dive on building teacher-learning communities and how those communities can be levers for school-wide change. And then I'm doing another session on adaptive leadership, looking at some of the theories of Ron Heifetz, and a case study of how we create cultural change in our schools.
You sound like you'd be pretty busy between now and then. Good thing you have all these snow days to catch up on your presentation.
There you go. There you go.
Outside of having my first experience as the director of a day school network at a national conference and learning what that experience was like, I will have two presentations myself. I'll be presenting on the use of a Ning as the driving thread for connecting professional development in schools when we are too busy to be together in the same space, how we can use a virtual tool to ensure that all things are happening as they ought to. And then with Harry Bloom from Page, I will be presenting on how small schools can actually use social media to leverage their resources to do a better job with recruiting and retaining students in small Jewish day schools. And we're just putting this out there because we don't know that this is actually going to happen, but Mark and I are hoping that in addition to our multiple presentations and all the other good things that happen at the conference, we hope that our next podcast actually will happen live from the North American Jewish Day School Conference. We will make history with the first live podcast of the conference. We hope to use that as an opportunity to bring in exciting guests who will be there. All of that is to be determined very shortly, but we hope to not only see you there, but we hope to be broadcasting there as well. We are grateful to all who stayed with us. We're about 5-10 minutes later than we normally are, but it was well worth it. Mark, any closing thoughts or comments?
No, let's hope for no more snow days, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the conference.
Wishing warm weather to all those who need it, and I too look forward to seeing everybody at the conference soon. Thanks again to Allison Thyme, and the last comment would be, as before, please, using the Eli Talks Facebook page or utilizing Twitter or just reaching out to either one of us, we really want to see more and more interaction. If you have thoughts about what we should be talking about in these podcasts, if you'd like to contribute during them, we really, really welcome the participation. So we hope to see you on social media soon. We are going to wrap. we can figure out how to turn off the podcast. Oh, technology.
Let's see here. I'm going to email our tech specialist.
I've already done that. We can just hang out now. Being live, just looking at each other.
What happens if we just hang up?
What happens if we just hang up? I don't know. I'm a little nervous to find out. It'll be blank space.
Matter. It'll just be matter.
It'll be black matter. It'll be antimatter.
It will not be matter full.
It will be unmatterness. All right, let's try it. On the count of 3. All right, Mark. On the count of 3, we're going to hang up, and we'll let Eli Talks handle the blank space when they edit.